My name is Harper Edwards. I am 34 years old. The moment my family casually announced over our group video call that the big reunion trip I'd been bankrolling for months was happening without me felt like a gut punch that left me breathless and questioning every sacrifice I'd ever made for them. It was supposed to honor my late mother's memory, a way to bring everyone together after her passing 3 years ago. But there they were, my father leading the charge with his firm tone, saying it would be more harmonious if I stayed behind since I always complicated things, while my older sister nodded along in agreement, and my brother-in-law smirked without a word of protest. The pain hit me hard, a deep ache that made my chest tighten as I realized how little I truly mattered to them after all the support I'd given. I sat there in silence for a second, then calmly muted my microphone and began drafting an email to the travel agency to cancel the remaining payments. But as I hit send, I couldn't shake the feeling that this small act would unleash a storm they never saw coming. Sitting there in my small apartment in Kansas City, Missouri, staring at the frozen faces on my laptop screen after I'd hung up, I felt a mix of anger and sadness washing over me in waves that made it hard to think straight. I'd been the one coordinating everything for this trip, from booking the cruise tickets to covering the deposits for the excursions, all because my father, Donald, had called me 6 months ago, his voice heavy with that familiar guilt trip edge, reminding me how much my late mother, Margaret, would have wanted us all to heal as a unit. He'd said it was my responsibility as the reliable one to make it happen, and like always, I'd agreed dipping into my savings as a junior accountant at a local firm, where the hours were long and the pay just enough to keep me afloat. Now, hearing him dismiss me so easily with my stepmother, Ellen, chiming in about how my independent lifestyle didn't fit the family vibe, it was like all those years of putting them first had been erased in one conversation. Have you ever poured your heart and resources into your family only to have them turn around and shut you out? It's the kind of betrayal that makes you question if blood really means anything. Share your thoughts in the comments if you've been through something similar. I remember how it all started building up to this point, though the signs had been there for years if I'd bothered to look closely. Growing up, my family had always leaned on me for the practical stuff, especially after my late mother passed away from a long illness when I was 31, leaving my father to remarry my stepmother a year later, who brought her own set of expectations into the mix. My older sister Vanessa, who was 38 at the time, had always been the one they doted on, the creative spirit who jumped from one passion project to another without ever sticking, while I was the steady earner they counted on to bail everyone out. It wasn't overt favoritism, at first just little things like my stepmother suggesting I help with my older sister's rent when her latest art venture flopped, or my father guilting me into co-signing a loan for my brother-in-law Kyle's failed startup idea because family supports each other. I'd done it all without complaint, telling myself it was what siblings and daughters did even as my own life stayed on hold. No vacations, no dating, just work and wiring money when the calls came. But this reunion trip was supposed to be different, a chance to reconnect and remember my late mother in a meaningful way, or so they'd pitched it during our first planning call back in January. My father had been the one to initiate, his voice crackling over the line as he described how we'd all gather on a Caribbean cruise, sharing stories and toasting to her memory, and how it would mean so much if I handled the finances since I was good with numbers. My stepmother had added her 2 cents, saying it was my duty to step up now that my older sister was busy with her new boutique business that my brother-in-law was managing. And before I knew it, I'd agreed to front $30,000 for the deposits, promising more as needed. What I didn't realize then was how they'd start making decisions without me, like choosing dates that conflicted with my work schedule or adding extras that jacked up the costs, always with that subtle pressure that if I didn't pay, I'd be letting down my late mother's legacy. The coercion ramped up sadly at first in those weekly check-in calls, where my older sister would casually mention how stressed she was and how the trip was her only light at the end of the tunnel, implying I'd be the villain if it fell through. My brother-in-law would jump in with his sarcastic jabs like, "Harper, you're the money wizard, wave your wand and make it happen." which always got a chuckle from my father, while my stepmother would smooth it over with guilt-laced comments about how family unity was all we had left after losing my late mother. I'd swallow my frustration, each time transferring another few $1,000s here and there, even as my own bills piled up and I skipped my annual checkup to save cash. But deep down, a nagging doubt started creeping in, especially after I confided in my best friend, Lisa Johnson, over coffee one afternoon, and she pointed out how one-sided it all seemed, asking why I never pushed back. Lisa had been my rock since college, a no-nonsense marketing coordinator who lived a few blocks away and always cut through the fog with her sharp insights. "Harper, they're treating you like a walking wallet," she'd said that day, her eyes narrowing as she stirred her latte. "When's the last time they asked about your life instead of your bank balance?" Her words stuck with me, creating this tiny crack in my resolve, but I brushed it off, convincing myself that trip would change things, that once we were all together, they'd see how much I contributed and appreciate me for it. Little did I know that crack was about to widen into a chasm during the call that led to my exclusion, leaving me wondering if I'd ever feel like part of the family again. As the months wore on, the requests kept coming, each one wrapped in layers of emotional manipulation that made it hard to say no without feeling like the bad guy. There was the time my father emailed me about upgrading to better cabins because my older sister needed space to unwind, attaching a bill for an extra $5,000 that he expected me to cover immediately, followed by a phone call where he sighed dramatically about how disappointed my late mother would be if we didn't do it right. My stepmother piled on during our next video chat, her voice dripping with that practiced concern as she mentioned how my older sister's health had been fragile lately, nothing specific, just enough to tug at my guilt strings, and how the trip was crucial for her recovery. Even my brother-in-law got in on it, sending me texts with links to add-ons like spa packages laced with snide remarks like, "Don't be cheap, sis-in-law, this is for the fam." I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling fan in my bedroom, calculating how much I'd already sunk into this close to $40,000 by then, and how it was eating into my emergency fund that I'd built so carefully over years of overtime shifts. My co-worker, Tom Harris, a senior accountant at the firm who I'd vented to during a lunch break, had raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the total, his tone laced with sarcasm as he said, "Sounds like you're funding their dream vacation while you get the Bill classic family math." Tom was the kind of guy who always delivered those cutting observations with a grin, but his words hit home, making me question for the first time if this was really about healing or just another way for them to coast on my efforts. The tension built to a head a week before that fateful exclusion call, when I tried gently pushing back on the latest request for funds to cover airfare upgrades. I'd called my father to explain that money was tight at work with some client delays, but he cut me off mid-sentence, his voice sharpening as he reminded me how my older sister had always been the sensitive one and how my selfishness could ruin everything we'd planned in my late mother's name. My stepmother jumped in, then gaslighting me with comments about how I was overreacting, that it was just a small ask compared to what family owed each other, leaving me feeling small and unreasonable by the end of the conversation. It was in that moment, as I hung up and paced my living room, that I started to see the pattern clearly: the constant coercion disguised as love, the way they wielded guilt like a weapon to keep me compliant. But even then, I didn't fully grasp how far they'd go until the group call where they dropped the bomb about excluding me entirely, claiming it was for everyone's comfort, without a hint of remorse in their voices. My older sister's agreement stung the most, her quiet, "Yeah, that makes sense," feeling like a betrayal after all the times I'd covered for her. Mistakes, while my brother-in-law's chuckle in the background added this layer of mockery that made my blood boil. Hanging up and canceling those payments was my first real act of defiance, but as I sat there in the quiet aftermath, a knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. What if this was just the beginning of their retaliation? The fallout from that cancellation email hit faster than I expected, starting with a barrage of texts from my older sister that lit up my phone like fireworks on the 4th of July. She accused me of being dramatic and selfish, claiming I'd ruined the one thing that could have brought us all closer, while my father followed up with a voicemail that dripped with disappointment, saying how my late mother would be ashamed of my sudden pettiness. It was classic emotional coercion, the kind they'd perfected over years, making me feel like the problem for finally drawing a line. But this time, instead of caving, I turned off my notifications and poured myself a glass of wine, letting the silence settle in my apartment as I wondered if this was the start of real freedom or just more isolation. The next morning, my stepmother called her voice sweet at first, but quickly turning sharp when I didn't immediately apologize, insisting that the exclusion was just a misunderstanding, and that I needed to reinstate the payments before the travel agency charged penalties. She wove in stories about how my older sister had been crying all night, how my brother-in-law's business was struggling, and this trip was their much-needed break, layering on the guilt until I felt that familiar pull to fix everything. But Lisa's words from our coffee chat echoed in my head, and I held firm, telling her calmly that I was done being the family's endless safety net, which only led to her snapping that I was acting out of jealousy toward my older sister's vibrant life. Hanging up, I felt a surge of resolve mixed with this gnawing loneliness, knowing they'd ramp up the pressure, but not sure how much more I could take before cracking. Over the following days, the coercion shifted from private calls to more public jabs, like when my father posted a vague status on our family Facebook group about ungrateful attitudes tearing us apart, which got likes from extended relatives I'd barely spoken to in years. My cousin Brenda Thomas, who I'd always been close to growing up, messaged me privately to ask what was going on, her tone neutral but probing, and I confided a bit about the financial drain and exclusion, only for her to later share that she'd heard from my older sister how I was sabotaging the reunion out of spite. It stung, realizing how quickly the narrative twisted against me, with my stepmother fueling the fire by emailing the whole family about rescheduling options that everyone except Harper could afford, positioning me as the outlier who didn't care about healing our shared grief over my late mother. Tom at work noticed my distraction during a team meeting, pulling me aside afterward with his usual wry grin to say, "Let me guess, family drama, sucking the life out of you again." He'd become a sort of unofficial mentor since joining the firm 2 years ago, always ready with a sarcastic quip that cut through the nonsense, and when I filled him in on the latest, he shook his head, suggesting I document everything in case it escalated further. His advice planted a seed, so that evening I started compiling emails and bank transfers on my laptop, tallying up the $45,000 I'd already spent on the trip, plus the countless other loans over the years, like the $10,000 for my older sister's boutique startup or the $8,000 to cover my brother-in-law's emergency car repair that turned out to be an upgrade. Seeing the numbers laid out made the exploitation crystal clear, but it also amplified the hurt knowing my family saw me more as a resource than a person. The pressure peaked a week later during an unexpected visit from my older sister and brother-in-law, who showed up at my door unannounced, their faces a mix of faint concern and underlying anger as they pushed inside without waiting for an invitation. My older sister started with tears, hugging me tightly while whispering how much she needed this trip to cope with her ongoing issues. But when I didn't budge, my brother-in-law cut in with his trademark sarcasm, saying, "Come on, Harper, stop playing the victim. We all know you're loaded from that fancy accounting job." My father had clearly briefed them, because they tag-teamed the guilt with my older sister, adding that skipping the reunion would dishonor our late mother's wish for unity, her voice cracking just enough to make me second-guess myself. I stood my ground, explaining my own financial strains and how I'd been stretched thin, but they dismissed it with eye rolls, my brother-in-law jabbing that I was always so dramatic about money, leaving me shaken as they stormed out, threatening to cut me out of future family events entirely. In the quiet that followed, I reached out to my Aunt Christine King, my late mother's sister, who'd always been more level-headed than the rest, hoping for some perspective during a long phone call that stretched into the night. She had moved to a nearby suburb after retiring from nursing, and though we didn't talk often, her straightforward advice had gotten me through tough spots before, like when I debated leaving a toxic ex years ago. Harper, they've been using your kindness as a crutch for too long, she said bluntly, her words laced with that protective edge, revealing how she'd overheard my stepmother complaining about my stubbornness at a recent lunch. It was validating but also heartbreaking, as she confirmed what I'd suspected: the family had already rebooked a scaled-down trip without me, using partial refunds to cover costs, effectively erasing my contributions while painting me as the problem. The irreversible consequence crept in, slowly manifesting first as sleepless nights, where I'd replay conversations questioning if I was overreacting or if setting boundaries meant losing them forever. Work suffered too, with a major client audit going sideways because I missed a deadline amid the distraction, leading my boss to pull me into his office for a stern talk about focus. Tom tried to cover for me, but the damage was done, putting my promotion at risk. Socially, invitations dried up, like when Brenda stopped responding to my texts after my older sister's influence spread, leaving me isolated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Even Lisa, busy with her own life, could only offer quick check-ins, and as the days turned to weeks, the weight of it all pressed down, making me wonder if standing up was worth the emotional exile. But the real blow came during a heated email exchange with my father, where he laid it all out if I didn't apologize and contribute to the new plans. I'd be persona non grata at holidays and milestones, his words cutting deep with accusations of abandonment that echoed the loss of my late mother all over again. My stepmother added fuel in a follow-up, gaslighting me about past generosities they'd extended, like letting me stay rent-free during college, conveniently forgetting how I'd paid it back tenfold since. It culminated in my older sister sending a group text announcing the trip's new itinerary, complete with photos of them packing, a deliberate exclusion that hit like a final nail, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. Just as I was about to respond with something I'd regret, my phone rang with an unknown number, and on the other end was a voice I didn't recognize, claiming to have information that could change everything about how I saw my family's motives. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Sarah Patel, who introduced herself as a former colleague of my brother-in-law's from his startup days, her tone hesitant but urgent. As she explained, she'd stumbled across my contact through mutual connections and felt compelled to reach out after hearing rumors about the family trip drama. She didn't waste time diving straight into details that made my stomach drop: how my brother-in-law had been boasting in old work chats about milking the in-laws for cash, including screenshots she'd saved where he laughed about using my funds for personal upgrades while planning to cut me out all along. It was a bombshell, confirming the manipulation I'd suspected but never fully faced. And as she forwarded the evidence to my email, I felt this mix of vindication and nausea, realizing my family had known, or at least turned a blind eye to his schemes. Armed with that info, I confronted them in a final group call. 2 days later, my voice steady as I laid out the screenshots and demanded an explanation. But my father shut it down immediately, calling it ancient history and accusing me of digging up a dirt to justify my abandonment. My stepmother piled on with her usual gaslighting, insisting Sarah was just a disgruntled ex-employee out for revenge, while my older sister defended my brother-in-law fiercely, her tears turning to anger as she claimed I was the one destroying our bond by not letting go of petty grudges. My brother-in-law himself stayed mostly silent, only muttering a sarcastic, "Thanks for the drama, Harper," before logging off, leaving me facing a wall of denial that made any real accountability feel impossible. It was clear then that no amount of proof would change their narrative. They'd always choose the path of least resistance, even if it meant sidelining me completely. In the weeks that followed, the isolation deepened in ways I hadn't prepared for, starting with radio silence from the family as they went ahead with the trip, posting sunny photos on social media that I could only view from afar after being blocked from the group chat. Brenda reached out once more, her voice soft over the phone, as she admitted she'd tried talking sense into my father, but got shut down, suggesting I consider therapy to process the grief, not just of losing my late mother, but of realizing my place in the family was conditional, at best. I took her advice, booking sessions with a counselor named Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a kind but direct woman in her 50s who worked out of a quiet office downtown, helping me unpack the years of emotional coercion through weekly talks that often left me drained but clearer-headed. Dr. Gonzalez's insights cut deep, pointing out patterns like how my father's remarriage had shifted dynamics, making me the outsider to protect the new harmony. But even as I gained understanding, the pain of rejection lingered like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Work became my refuge, though the earlier slip-ups had consequences. My boss demoted the promotion talk to a probationary period, citing reliability concerns, which meant longer hours without the pay bump I'd counted on to rebuild my savings. Tom tried to lighten the load, covering a few reports with his signature weight, joking that family's the original pyramid scheme, but his support only went so far in filling the void left by blood ties that felt irreparably frayed. Lisa checked in more often now, dragging me out for walks along the riverfront where we'd vent about everything, her sharp observations like, "They're not worth your sanity, girl," providing temporary relief. But nights alone in my apartment brought waves of regret, wondering if I'd pushed too hard or if staying silent would have preserved some semblance of connection. The painful choice came during Thanksgiving when an invitation finally arrived via email from my stepmother, worded carefully as if nothing had happened, expecting me to show up with the usual contributions, perhaps even chipping in for the meal. I stared at it for hours, Dr. Gonzalez's words echoing about choosing self-preservation over toxic cycles, but the pull of habit was strong, tempting me to swallow my pride and go just to avoid the final cut. In the end, I declined with a short reply, stating I needed space to focus on my own well-being, knowing it would likely seal my exile, but unable to keep pouring into a well that gave nothing back. Their response was swift, a curt acknowledgement from my father, followed by my older sister's accusatory text about how I'd officially chosen to be alone, with no apologies or olive branches in sight. Months dragged on, the family thriving in their bubble as far as I could tell from distant updates through Brenda, who became my occasional lifeline with neutral reports that only highlighted what I'd lost. My brother-in-law's business picked up somehow, my older sister's boutique gained traction, and my father and stepmother planned more gatherings. I wasn't part of their lives moving forward untouched by the fallout. I threw myself into small changes, joining a book club where I met a friendly librarian named Rachel Nguyen, who shared stories of her own family estrangements over coffee meets, offering a glimmer of new community, but it couldn't replace the ache of holidays spent solo or birthdays marked by silence. Work stabilized eventually, with Tom advocating for me during reviews, but the financial hole from the trip lingered, forcing me to pick up freelance gigs that ate into my free time. Looking back, standing up felt like the right move in theory. But the reality was messier, a defeat wrapped in quiet survival, where I didn't win justice or reconciliation, just the heavy knowledge that some bonds break under their own weight. My family remained stronger in their unity, untouched by reflection, while I navigated the loneliness of boundaries that came too late. It was a painful failure, choosing the lesser evil of isolation over endless exploitation, leaving me with regret for the years wasted and sadness for the connections that might never mend. Thank you for listening to my story. It's still raw to share, but putting it out there helps. If you've ever had to walk away from family without a clean win, how did you cope with the aftermath? Let me know in the comments.